Welcome, everyone. My name is Layan Falehan, and I am the Education Director here at the People's Forum. And I'm so excited to have Dr. Rashid Khalidi with us today to talk about this incredible book, The 100 Years' War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance from 1917 to 2017. Welcome to the People's Forum. If you haven't been here before, we are a political and cultural center here for education programs, art programs, music programs. We're an open space to the public, and we encourage you to check out all of our programs, our classes, and our different events. So please make sure you check in with our staff and our folks here if you have any questions. I am honored to introduce Rashid. Rashid Khalidi is the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University. He received his BA from Yale University in 1970 and his Doctor of Philosophy from Oxford University in 1974. He's taught in many places, such as the Lebanese University, the American University of Beirut, Georgetown University, and University of Chicago. And he is also the co-editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies. And a prolific writer, he has written many books, too many to list now, but some that you may know: Resurrecting Empire, Western Footprints and America's Perilous Path in the Middle East, The Iron Cage, The Story of the Palestinian Struggle for Statehood, Sowing Crisis, The Cold War and American Dominance in the Middle East, and Brokers of Deceit, How the U.S. has Undermined Peace in the Middle East, and most recently, from 2020, just 1 month before the pandemic, as we were talking about just now, The 100 Years' War on Palestine. This is an absolutely incredible book. I have so many questions and thoughts and things that I would love to ask you, but before bombarding you with all of that, maybe you can start by telling us why this book, what brought you to write this kind of book in this moment, right in this, it's almost, we can't imagine that time 2 years ago before the pandemic, but what brought you to write this book in this way?
Well, thanks for having me. This is I think my second live event besides teaching since the pandemic, and it's a pleasure to see real people in front of me instead of a screen. So thank you all for coming. What brought me to write this book? What brought me to write this book in particular was my son and one of my cousins. My son Smail, who's a playwright, and one of my cousins, kept after me saying, enough already with the scholarly monographs. Please write something that people will find accessible, that will tell this story and will be engaging. And they kept after me, especially my son. They kept nagging me. And then they kept giving me good ideas. So that's really why I came to write it. I mean, I realized that the tide of misinformation and distortion and denial really can only be dealt with by something that regular readers can appreciate. And I was very pleased when the book came out, in spite of the pandemic, that it got such a good reception. So I hope it has reached an audience beyond the audience that some of my other books on Palestine have reached, which are mainly, academics and students and so on. So that's why I wrote it. And I wrote it because my son would not stop harassing me.
I mean, I think if you haven't read this book, please pick it up and take a look at it. I think even just the cover, the title, in and of itself, gives you a whole statement. It gives you an argument. How many times do we see the situation in Palestine framed as an ongoing war from before 1948, from 1917? Everything already. And you've already introduced that this is actually not just a history of one conflict. It's a settler colonial history. Even just in this first page, it's already giving so much information. It really is such an accessible, a history of 100 years usually is a lot thicker than this. But you've managed to give it without losing anything in this way. It's really impressive.
I actually intended the title and the subtitle to be provocative and let the reader know from the beginning that I was trying to demolish some of the false narratives and some of the false frameworks. This is a conflict that's been going on since time immemorial. Complete rubbish. 150, 200 years ago, there was no conflict of this sort and had not been ever before. This is not an ancient conflict, brand new. Colonialism, imperialism, Palestine. Starts with the late 19th, early 20th century. Secondly, I wanted to make it clear by talking about not a war in Palestine, but a war on Palestine, that this was not a conflict between equals. This was not two peoples struggling against one another. Yes, there are two peoples. Yes, there's a struggle. But it is an entirely unequal conflict in which not just Palestinians and Israelis, but Palestinians ranged against a whole number of other powers. In fact, all the powers at different times. Great Britain at the height of its imperial magnificence. The United States and the Soviet Union at the time of partition. Britain and France, and then most recently again the United States, and in many cases Arab governments as well. So this was a war on Palestine and the Palestinians, not a tragic conflict between two peoples. So I was trying to create a new frame. It's not new. I mean, other people have argued the same thing before, and I figured I'd do it, right at the outset.
Amazing. Can we lower the mic a little bit? Thanks. You've separated the book into 6 declarations of war. I think it's a really interesting structure to move through this history. Could you talk a little bit about how you came to this division?
I did that, I think, because it followed on from what I just mentioned. I wanted to make it clear that the Palestinians were up against a quite daunting set of opponents, and that it wasn't just Zionism and Arab nationalism or Palestinian nationalism or Palestinian national movement and the state of Israel. There were much larger forces at play. So these declarations of war are, in fact, in the first instance, the Balfour Declaration and the Mandate. That's the British who issued a declaration of war. And in fact, the British fought that war. During the Mandate, the British brought 100,000 troops to Palestine. They killed, wounded, imprisoned, or exiled between 10 and 17% of the adult male population of Palestine. So the war was declared by the British and waged by the British. So to say the Arabs and the Jews, no. The actual war was a war that the British, through the League of Nations, declared by saying that we're going to create a national home for what was at that time a tiny minority in an Arab-inhabited country, and then executing that. Same thing is true of the Partition Resolution of 1947. The Zionist movement benefited from it. The State of Israel resulted from it. But Israel didn't pass it. The Americans and the Soviets passed it. And similarly in 1967 with UN Security Council 242. Those are the first 3 declarations of war. So what I'm trying to do is to say that this is a conflict in which the Palestinians were not just up against this colonial settler project, which had a national content to it, which is, say, Zionism, but up against these very powerful sponsors and backers of the Zionist project.
It's almost in parts difficult to go through the history because it's so clear from the information you've put into these pages just how much the Palestinian people have been and continue to be up against. But then you also have inclusions of moments of real resistance that are really very impressive and incredible. One of them that I think maybe is new to many people because we don't hear about it so much was the Battle of Khari in 1968. I don't know if you could talk a little bit more about this.
Sure. I mean, you pointed to something that's also I wanted to gesture to in the title, because it's not just a colonial settler war. Most colonial settler wars end up with the colonial settler population exterminating or confining to a tiny part of their former territory the indigenous population. That's what happened where we are in Manhattan, which is not an Anglo name, as you may have noticed, or Canada or Australia or New Zealand. In fact, there was ferocious resistance. There always is ferocious resistance. And in this case, that resistance has continued for the entire period that I cover in the book. There were various phases of it, and you're referring to a battle that took place in March of 1968. After the resurrection of the Palestinian national movement, following the defeat of 1948, following the Nakba, following the expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians, it looked like the Palestinian national movement had been shattered. And many people Zionists and their supporters were saying, you know, they're gone. I think Golda Meir said, what did she say? The old will die and the young will forget, something like that. But Palestinian national movement rebuilt itself, and it based itself on what they called at that time armed struggle. And so they were beginning guerrilla operations into the occupied territories from Jordan. And the Israelis, who have a policy of extremely aggressive preemption, which goes back to training by the British. I found out in Ireland, this is a British policy. This is a policy that was taught to people like Moshe Dayan, taught to people like Yigal Allon by British officers in the 1930s and 40s. So as part of this extreme aggressive preemption, the Israeli army sent several brigades across the Jordan River to attack guerrilla bases around the town of Karami on the east side of the Jordan River in Jordan. And they expected that that would be a walk in the park. There was really ferocious resistance, both from the Palestinians, but also from Jordanian artillery in the hills. And the Israelis suffered a lot of losses. And it was really it sort of galvanized the Arab world after the crushing defeat of June 1967, which was only 8 months earlier. And you had a state of psychological, I don't know what the word is. People were stunned throughout the Arab world by that defeat. Suddenly, it was like a lightning bolt. Well, here were people who had stood up, they fought, and they held their ground. It was enormously encouraging to Palestinians, but also to people all over the Arab world. It had an effect out of all proportion. It was not a big battle. I mean, hundreds were killed on one side. The Israelis had 56, I forget the exact number of casualties, not enormous casualties, but they lost armored vehicles, they were bloodied, and they had to withdraw. And that in and of itself, after what had happened in 67, which was a humiliating defeat for the Arab armies, made an enormous contrast.
One element that comes through at different moments in your book related to this actually is you raise the issue of the Arab public in contrast to the Arab states at times. Also the American public, sometimes the European public. Can you talk a little bit about how you mapped out the influence of these different publics, as you say, or perhaps the role that they played in Palestinian resistance or in the development of the Zionist project?
I'm glad you asked that question. People don't usually ask me that question. That's a good one. One of the things that is, I'm going to go from the present backwards. One of the things that's occluded, that's hidden in the media coverage of Palestine is the extent to which there is visceral support among Arab public opinion for the Palestinians. And this has been occluded partly by the fact that most Arab governments have come to terms with the existence of Israel, have no intention of fighting it, are in most cases actually on very close terms with the Israeli government, and really would like the Palestine issue to go away. Now, this is true of governments that are at peace with Israel formally, Egypt, Jordan. This is true of governments that have established formal diplomatic relations with Israel, the Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco. But it's also true of several other Arab governments that have subterranean relationships with Israel, and in any case, don't represent the views of their people. This is the most undemocratic region of the entire world, by the way. This is a region in which public opinion is actively, aggressively suppressed by autocratic, dictatorial, in some cases monarchical, in some cases quote-unquote Republican regimes. So one of the things that comes through in the very good polling that we have of countries all over the Arab world is that support for the Palestinians is very high. It has always been. I mean, historically, I've gone back to periods like the 30s and the 40s. You had hundreds and hundreds of people coming to Palestine to volunteer to fight with the Palestinians from North Africa, from Egypt, from the Gulf, and from the Levant, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and so on. And that's always been the case. There's always been that support. Now, the governments are in another place. Governments are, in some cases, very strongly influenced in the past by imperialist powers, today by the United States, and they're afraid of Israel. And in some cases, they have material interests that are very close to the interests of Israel. So that's the Arab world. And I think the problem of the Arab world is a problem of democracy and autocracy as much as anything else in terms of Palestine. One of the reasons that Israel supports anti-democratic, autocratic regimes is because it realizes that if you had democracy in the Arab world, that public opinion would count. Now we have a system here which, as we may have noticed, doesn't always represent what people really want. Take any major issue. Do people want to go to war? No. Do people want to spend as much as we spend on defense? No. I could go up and down a list. But we have a government which doesn't often represent, or often doesn't represent, those interests. Now, on the issue of Palestine and on the issue of Israel, there's very strong support for Israel among large segments of American public opinion. One of the interesting things that's happening is that support has decreased in recent decades. It was wall to wall as a result of a variety of factors. Back from the time of Wilson right up through, I would say, the 60s and 70s, even into the 80s and 90s. That has ceased to be the case in the last couple of decades. The Democratic Party, for example, if you look at polling, especially progressive Democrats, in particular, but Democrats in general, have become much more sympathetic to the Palestinians and much less tolerant of the things that Israel does. And that's consistent polling over years and years and years. This is not 2022 or 2020. You can go back 6, 7, 8, 10 years. That's not true across party lines. That's not true in all districts of the country. That's not true in all age groups. It's much truer of younger people than it is of older people. Older people, most of them are living in the past. You know, they're living with the echo of the Holocaust. They're living with a whole mythical narrative of Israel's creation, and they can't let go of that. Most of them, not all of them. Younger people are not affected only by those things. They may understand the importance of these things, but they see things more or less as they are. Israel is a gigantic superpower. The Palestinians are oppressed. Most younger people see that. When I was a student, long ago in university, I remember Golda Meir came to speak on our campus. This was 1969, I think it was, or 68. She wasn't prime minister at the time, so probably 68. And there were 4 of us protesting, and there were like 1,000 people. And that was about the balance on campus, 1,000 to 4. Well, today, I was just talking to somebody, 350 people from different universities, professional schools, went on something called PalTrek to Palestine. I mean, we didn't have 350 people in the entirety of the United States supporting the Palestinian cause on all campuses. Today at Columbia, today at places like Brown, today at many other universities, resolutions in support of BDS pass with huge majorities. So at least among young people, at least among progressives, there is an entirely new situation. There are 2 dozen or maybe 3 dozen people in Congress who are not afraid to support a resolution that says Israel shouldn't beat on children. In the past, you'd have people who would support a resolution that Israel should beat on children because they're terrorists. I mean, they might not go that far. But pretty much anything that AIPAC drafted for them, they would pass. That's still generally true, but you, for the first time, have a segment of Congress which represents, you know, some significant part of progressive opinion in the United States that is willing to at least take some measured positions on Palestine. That was never possible in the past.
What do you think has brought this shift in opinion?
That's a really hard question to answer. I have to say, I think that the grip of the corporate media, of the mainstream corporate media, has been loosened by social media and by other forms of communication. I remember when I started teaching a while ago, I would mention something that had been on TV news or that had been in the New York Times, and a certain proportion of people in the class would sort of nod their heads. They had seen the item. That's not true anymore. People don't read the New York Times. I mean, younger people don't read or if they do, they get it through a feed. They get some stuff. They have a much wider range of sources for information today, people, especially younger people. And the further you go down on the age scale, the more that's true. So that's one thing. I think people are more traveled. People know more languages than 50 or 100 years ago. This is the most monoglot country on the face of the earth. Fewer people, I mean, we have a huge number of people in this country speak Spanish, and you have many immigrant communities where people still speak the languages of their native countries. But for most Americans, English is the only language they will ever know. That's changed a little bit with younger people. It was also a country where most people didn't have passports 50 years ago. They hadn't traveled. People have traveled more. So I think those are among the elements. I think also, frankly, the failure of the Palestinian national movement, especially in the last decade or 2 or 3 decades, to put forward a clear narrative has not had as much of a negative effect as the failure of the Zionist project and of Israel to say stuff that younger people, will believe. You can talk about startup nation and Israel being gay friendly and all of that stuff, but people, they see the evidence of what happens in Palestine if they have any kind of access. And I think that that's changed people's views.
And perhaps they can relate to it more. It feels, especially in these years of crisis, that more and more people are seeing the hypocrisy of the way our society is run, are feeling like they can relate, perhaps, in a way.
I think also in this country, you can talk about settler colonialism and you can talk about racism in the 21st century in a way that you could only do with difficulty in the 20th. I mean, I know that's a huge generalization. And I'm not just talking about Black Lives Matter, and I'm not just talking about Standing Rock. I'm talking about a general awareness. I mean, you wouldn't have this ferocious culture war waged by the Republican Party on critical race theory, about which I would guess 99.5% of Republicans couldn't define it if their lives depended on it. They're fighting this culture war because they're terrified at the change that's taking place in people's understandings of racism and settler colonialism. I mean, the two sort of, if you want to, founding sins or original sins of the United States are things that now people are a little bit knowledgeable about, or much more knowledgeable about, at least, than they used to be. And I think you can talk about Palestine in a way that is relatable because of that, at least to the generation that has had its eyes opened. So I think that's another element. I think the fact that similar things are happening in England and Belgium and France about their colonial era has made people, younger people especially, more sensitive to those things. I mean, everybody looks at Le Pen. Look at the vote for Mélenchon. I mean, he was within, I forget the number of tens of thousands. He was within tens, 20, 50, 100, whatever thousand votes of coming in second in this election. And I think that's and that represents mainly younger people, okay? The generation that supported the French Communist Party or the left-wing French socialists of the 50s and 60s. Those people are gone. These are younger voters. And I think here and in countries that are beginning to come to terms with their colonial legacy, that generation is a little more susceptible to listening, at least, where Palestine is concerned.
On this topic of relatability, I think one thing that's very unique about this book is the way that you also tell this through the eyes of your family members. And I think that opens a door in a way to someone who might be new to this history, rather than just telling the facts. What was that like?
That was very, very hard. For those of you who haven't read the book, I again, responding to the pressure of my son, who said to me, you tell us stories about what you've seen, and you tell us stories about what your father told you, and you tell us stories about what your aunts told you. Put those in the book. You know, make it a relatable book in which you talk in the first person about things you were told, things you have read, things you have seen, and so on. And so I did that. And I mean, you know, I come from a very privileged background in terms of Palestine. My family was involved in politics over generations in a period when the Palestinian elite dominated politics. And I've been an observer. That ceased to be the case after 1948. But I've been an observer through my parents, through my family, and then myself in the last several decades of many, many things that have happened. And so really at the instigation, especially of my son, but also of my cousin and my editor, to her credit, I decided to relate as much as was appropriate of this story in first-person terms, or through the eyes of people, if not my family members, people I knew. I mean, I didn't know my wife's grandfather, but I knew the stories about him from my mother-in-law, from my wife's uncle, who told me about him, and I had his memoirs. And so through the first-person narratives of people I knew or knew of or had access to, I tried to make this relatable in a way that a dry history simply would not. So my uncle being in exile, the British loved to send anti-colonial militants into exile on islands, the Seychelles, Malta, St. Helena. They loved to do that. They loved to do that. Sri Lanka, that was their favored prison for militants. So my uncle was sent off to exile for 3 years, 2.5 years, to the Seychelles Islands, which is now a vacation paradise, I am told, but was not when he was sent there. And then he was kept in exile for several more years elsewhere. So I figured, tell that story. People should understand that they killed, wounded, exiled, and imprisoned as much as 17% of the Arab adult male population in the country over a period of a couple of years. And that's a way of telling that story.
I think the other effect this has, this aspect of the book, it also really helps push back against that narrative that we always hear, that this is an interminable conflict that's been going on since the beginning of time. Actually, no, it's something that you can trace back so recently.
I mean,
in one family.
I start the story with one of my great uncles who writes this letter in 1899. So that's 123 years ago. And that's really the beginning. I mean, you could go back maybe a few more years, but that's really the beginning. And it becomes what it is in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration. The origins of Zionism, the origins of Arab nationalism, those go back a little further. But this struggle in its current form is created by British imperialism. There's no other way of interpreting it. Now you can elide the imperialism and say Britain did a wonderful thing in issuing the Balfour Declaration, but the Balfour Declaration is still the fons et origo. It's the beginning of this thing as it has been. Before was a different world, and since has been a different world. And that's not a long time ago. I mean, my father was born 2 years before that, my dad. So my mother and father were born in 1915, 2 years before the Balfour Declaration. So you go back 2 generations, that's the beginning. I'm old, so you guys go back 3 generations, whatever.
I'm sure there's questions in the audience. I just have maybe 1 or 2 more before we open it up. You end the book almost with some hope as well, and also a pretty sober assessment of where we're going geopolitically, and that things are changing. The US may not have the same kind of unfettered freedom to do whatever it wants to do in the West Asian and North African region at this point. There's other players coming into the scene. This was in 2020, maybe, when you wrote this. How do you see the situation now?
Yeah, actually, I finished the writing in 2019. I don't see it any differently in the larger sense. I think that the trends that I saw in 2019 in the Arab world, in Israel, among Palestinians, in the United States, and globally, haven't changed that much. I mean, I just described the trends in the United States. Now, are we going to have another wave of black reaction in the next 2, 3, 4 years in this country? Maybe. But I don't think that those basic trends, those demographic trends, the changes among younger people, I don't think that in the medium to long term, those are going to cease. I don't see good things for the Palestinian national movement in the short run, unfortunately. I don't see good things in terms of a transformation of Israeli politics in the short run, unfortunately. But I think that global trends are working in the direction, maybe in the medium term, that could change things in Palestine and Israel. Ultimately, I mean, Israel is an incredibly powerful actor. It's a nuclear superpower, regional superpower. They've bombed 7, 8 Arab countries. Their neighbors are scared witless of them. Scared witless. You cannot, they bombed Tunisia. They've bombed Egypt, they've bombed Sudan, they've bombed Syria, they've bombed Lebanon. I could go on and on. Bombed Iraq. And they've made themselves feared in the region. Nevertheless, you have a project which has always depended on external support. It is powerful. It has all kinds of forms of independence. It's a sovereign nation state. But it has always depended on a pipeline of money coming from outside. If you spend any time in Palestine, if you go to any Israeli city, you go to any Israeli university, you go to any Israeli hospital, you go to any Israeli monument, and look at where the money comes from. It comes from here. It comes from Europe as well. Without that money, Israel is not Israel. Where does the capital for this fantastic technological wonder come from? It's coming from here. It is entirely dependent in certain respects on a connection to Euro-America, is and has always been. I mean, that's part, it's not a classical settler colonial project. It's completely, I'm learning as I work on a new project about settler colonialism, about Ireland and about others. Israel is unique in that respect. There's nothing like Israel in terms of settler colonial projects. But one thing that's true is this external support. Well, that external support is dependent on some pretty precarious political situations, globally, strategically, in Europe and in the United States. Democratic Party, or more progressive element of the Democratic Party, wins big in 2028, 2029, 2030, whatever it may be. Things change for Israel fundamentally. If things change in Europe, things change for Israel fundamentally. China's rise. I mean, I could talk about other things, India, Russia. Israel is led by very smart people. They have developed excellent relations with all the rising powers of the 21st century. They're working with the Brazilians and the Indians and the Russians and the Chinese. They have very clearly understood that they have to diversify. And they've done that in the past. I mean, Herzl starts out going to the German Kaiser. He starts out going to the Ottoman Sultan. He tries the French. His successor swings it, finally, with the British. In another generation, Ben-Gurion spends several years in the United States and lays the groundwork for switching over from Britain to the United States. They then switch to Britain and France again in the 50s. They could switch again. My point is they depend on external support. And that external support may not be there in the future. And in essence, theirs is a project which is innately hostile to democracy and liberalism, innately hostile to equality. You cannot have a Jewish state in which one group is privileged legally and talk about equality and talk about democracy. It cannot be a state of all of its citizens if it's a Jewish state. It's a contradiction in terms. And that's an inherently anti-democratic, unjust, and illiberal system in its nature, in its conception, in its legal structure. It's not just, they could change their minds. They would have to change structures. You'd have to, in other words, decolonize. And that's not an easy thing to do. They haven't succeeded with it in some parts of Africa. I'm talking about South Africa, Southwest Africa, I'm talking about Algeria. They're still decolonizing decades after independence in Algeria, in my view. You've got to get rid of the colonialism of the mind, and you've got to get rid of colonial structures. And so we're a long way from that in Palestine. The point is that colonial structure is dependent on external support. And part of that external support involves a denial of what the reality of Israel is. If you ask people in Congress, why are you supporting Israel? It's a liberal democracy, the only democracy in the Middle East. They've ruled a population as large as theirs without, the slightest hint of democracy for 55 years. But they're the only democracy. How can it be the only democracy? I mean, you've occupied people for more than half a century. No rights whatsoever. But that blindness in one eye, if it disappears, puts Israel in enormous peril. And that's not going to happen tomorrow. I'm not sure if it will ever happen. But if you ask me why would I be optimistic, that would be one reason. They may move to support from illiberal regimes, which don't care. That could happen. But even then, they'll still have, I would argue they would still have a really uphill road to go. And then the alternative of decolonization is always there. It has worked in some cases. The Irish may yet succeed. The South Africans are succeeding. It can be done.
I think I'd like to see if there's questions from the folks who are here in the audience. Would anyone like to share any thoughts or a question? And we'll bring a microphone to you.
One second, I have a microphone.
How would you explain, the Israeli strategy of beating people with batons in the Al-Aqsa Mosque? I mean, it doesn't look good just to the world. So why, don't they have a better idea of how to, handle themselves?
I mean, if it was just beating people with batons, firing tear gas in a mosque. I mean, can you imagine if in Temple Emmanuel or St. Patrick's, cops burst in and didn't just beat people, they fired tear gas inside the synagogue or inside the church. Can you imagine? I mean, the only explanation for it, in my view, is first of all, they seem to sense, I think mistakenly, that they have a certain kind of invulnerability as far as Western public opinion is concerned. They can get away with it. The second thing is, I think that they are hardened by generations of this, what I called, I have yet to figure out a term for it, this aggressive preemption. You beat them so hard that they don't dare do whatever it is you don't want them to do. And that has always been the approach of the Israeli military and security establishment. And they can't control it. I mean, in this country, we have been trying to restrain the police ever since people realized that the police are a vector of brutality. And we're not succeeding. I mean, the number of people murdered on the roads every year by police, stops when they stop a car, just doesn't decrease. So there is a built-in structural mental approach to certain kinds of institutions, which I think is part of it. Finally, this is all determined by domestic politics. You have a weak coalition government, which includes people from the far right of the Israeli political spectrum, being challenged by the rest of the far right, and they're afraid to look soft. So that's also part of it. And I think that if you were to ask me which of those three elements, the media, the sense of media invulnerability and the sort of institutional brutality and the domestic politics that is most important, I would say probably the third. You can take off your mask so I can hear you.
Hi. What are some of the like economic or like geopolitical like motivations for Europe and the United States like continue support of Israel, whether it's like nuclear arms in the region or I'm actually like more unclear about the economy of Israel,
right.
and since it's so important, as you've said, and it always detailed in the book, that they have so much external financial economic support, I'm wondering what's coming out of Israel.
Right. That's a really good question, and it's not an easy question to answer, to tell you the honest truth. There are multiple strands. There's actually a strategic strand. Israel had managed to sell itself to the United States at the height of the Cold War as an invaluable ally against the Soviet Union. And that was essentially a crock. It wasn't really true, but it was a great sales strategy. And Israel became integrated into the American military-industrial complex's planning for the region. When the Cold War ended, in 89, 90, the Israelis were in search of another strategic, pretext for this alliance with the United States. And in 9/11, they found it. Terrorism. They were the experts, the masters of dealing with terrorism. And of course, what happened in the United States was terrorism, and terrorism was a generic thing. They were all the same. You had terrorologists, you had professors of terrorism, you had a bunch of people who knew nothing about any of the cases they were talking about, couldn't know the languages, didn't know the languages of the countries they were referring to, wouldn't have been able to find their way from the airport to the Hilton without a minder, telling us about why bin Laden did this and why Hamas did the other. And the Israelis just cashed in on that. Half the airports in the world run protocols that were developed in Israel. Half of the spyware in the world is generated out of Israel. And I could go on and on and on and on. They peddle their expertise in controlling recalcitrant populations all over the world to autocratic governments. And so they've transmogrified from being a Cold War ally into being the experts with dealing with subject populations, whether that's policing in American cities or whether that's the Singapore government wanting to keep down people. Finally, they have very powerful domestic support in most of these countries. I mean, you look at the British Labour Party, you look at the British Conservative Party, they're full of, vibrant supporters of the State of Israel. That's true of both of our political parties here. So there are multiple strands to this. And it goes back to an understanding. Edward Said once wrote something about how, in addition to everything else that the Zionist movement did, he was talking about their early years, they understood that this was an issue of narrative. They understood this was a discursive war. And they were fighting the discursive war long before anybody else was even aware of it, long before the Palestinians or the Arabs were engaged in such a war. David Ben-Gurion, first Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, second President of the State of Israel, are expelled by the Ottoman Empire in, I think, 1915 or 1916. They come to New York and they work here building up the networks and the support groups and the financial and the media and the public relations effort that later becomes a vibrant Zionist movement in the United States. Imagine that. The two of the main leaders of the movement spent years in New York. They understood. And this is where the movement first declared its intentions to turn all of Palestine into a Jewish state at the Biltmore Conference on 1942, Biltmore Hotel up on, I think, Lexington Avenue. And this is where most of the money comes from. So they have this entrenched, deeply entrenched, well-organized network of support, which has actually grown in the United States with the movement of a lot of evangelicals into blind support for Israel. So it transcends political parties, it transcends religions. It's a powerful, I mean, they have real strong support. Whence Israel's getting more money than any other country in American foreign aid, historically.
Hi. So I have two questions. The first question is about the passage of time. Like when someone, for example, sees the title on the book. Okay, sorry. Since like so much time has passed since the beginning of the, colonization project, this kind of like make people think that, well, this happened also to the US and we're living in it and everything is fine. So, and especially that there are also like people who are like now call themselves like citizens of Israel. And like how do we deal with this when we try to make an argument? And okay, I have another question. But
let me answer that one and then maybe we'll get back to the other one. You put your finger on something that's really hard to deal with. I've been working on Ireland. You have people who are settled there by the English crown 850 years ago. And more were then brought in 500 years ago. And more were then brought in 400 years ago, 1600s, 1700s. Are these people indigenous now? Are they settlers? Or are they natives? I mean, they're like 20 generations, some of them have been there. What are we, those of us, some of us in this room may have come well, actually everybody came as an immigrant unless you're a Native American. But are we natives now? I mean, I was born in New York City. I'm a New York native, right? But I'm actually also an immigrant and a settler. So I think that if I understand the question you're asking, you're saying what happens to the settler population? Well, one of the things that the Irish have tried to argue, Irish nationalists have tried to argue, is that everybody now has to be understood and accepted as a native, okay? That is to say, people who were brought in by the English crown to settle and oppress the native Irish population as part of a settler colonial project have to now be understood as natives of Ireland. And accommodation has to be made with them now. On what terms, how, when, we still haven't figured that out, or they haven't. It's not our business. They still haven't figured that out. And the Palestinians still haven't figured it out. You have Palestinians who will insist on calling any Israeli a settler. Well, in a certain sense, all of them are, just like we are all in the United States settlers. But the element of time actually does come into it at some stage. Australians, New Zealanders, Canadians, American, US citizens, all of us are part of a settler colonial project. And at the same time, I think we have to accept that all of us at a certain point have to be seen also as natives. But the settler thing can never be forgotten. Mahmoud Mamdani has a very interesting book, started as an article. When does the settler become a native? And I don't think that's the last word on the subject. It's been critiqued by a good friend of mine, Raif Izrei, who has written a brilliant critique of it. So I think that that's a subject that has to be discussed.
Yeah, do you think that the continuous resistance of the Palestinian people, this is like a follow-up to this question, is that okay? Do you think that the continuous resistance of the Palestinian people play a role in making an argument? And how do you distinguish the case of Palestine from other like countries like the US, for example?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are great scholars of settler colonialism, people like Patrick Wolf and Veracini and so on, who have argued for various ways of distinguishing between different cases of settler colonialism. The Zionist project never intended to eliminate the Palestinians by killing them genocidally, which at certain stages the English actually tried to do in Ireland, which in the United States was practiced, which in several of these more successful settler colonial projects was the ambition and to a certain extent succeeded. That was less the case in many other settler colonial projects. I mean, Algeria, in Kenya, in South Africa, in Namibia, what was once called Southwest Africa, and in Palestine, and in Ireland. Whatever the original intention of the colonizer was, they certainly didn't succeed in genocidally eliminating the population. And in each of those cases, if not a majority, about half of the population is still made up of the native indigenous population. That's the case in Palestine. Half the people living between the river and the sea are Palestinian Arabs. Even today, after an ethnic cleansing in 1948, after continuous attempts to reduce the Palestinian demography of the country, half the population is still Palestinian Arab. In Ireland, obviously, the proportions are even. And I think that Ireland and Palestine represent a sort of a tipping point as between those countries where the native population was just genocidally eliminated, and those like Algeria and South Africa, where that simply didn't happen or couldn't happen, which maybe explains why these two struggles are still ongoing. You know, South Africa is resolved, and Algeria and Kenya and so on have resolved. Rhodesia, remember Rhodesia? Zimbabwe, what we call Zimbabwe. It was once called Rhodesia. It was a white colony, white settler colony. They failed completely. And so there are many white Zimbabweans, there are many white South Africans, so there are still people of settler origin who live there as citizens, but the settler colonial regime has been overthrown. So I think that there is that, I don't know what you want to call it, a range from one extreme to the other. And there's also the matter of time. I mean, in Ireland, everybody accepts that everybody living in Ireland today is Irish, whether you're Protestant or you're Catholic, whether you live in the north or the south. The question is, on what terms will they live with one another? And I think the Irish are a little closer to resolving this, maybe, inshallah, I hope, than maybe we are.
Okay.
Maybe let someone else ask a question. You can get back to your third question.
Well, thank you for that question, because it just opened up so many different thoughts. So I'll try to stick on the original one I had. You spoke about how maybe one of the shifts comes from the fact that the Zionist narrative doesn't reach young people as well. And then you mentioned that that's kind of despite the fact that the Palestinian narrative, national narrative isn't necessarily singular or strong. So what are maybe some of those diverging points, or what are a few narratives that are in the popular conscious? Because I think from the American perspective, we only see it as a struggle, but that's not necessarily an identity. So
That's a good question. I mean, I think a couple things have to be said. Settler colonial projects often claim divine sanction. Look at the Puritans. City on a hill, God's people, there are all kinds of religious motifs. The Boers in South Africa, same kind of thing. They believed they were divinely guided. But I don't think you can actually beat the Old Testament of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, for a religious claim. I mean, it is the Ur text for making a 21st or 20th century religiously based claim. And so Zionism has that, enormous advantage. There's nobody familiar with the Bible who doesn't know about Moses, does not know about, various aspects that tie the Jewish religion to the land of Israel. There's nobody no Christian, no Muslim, no Christian, no Muslim, and no Jew, because the Quran also contains all kinds of references to the Jewish connection to Jerusalem and to Palestine. So no monotheist is ignorant of some of these, of the basis of some of these claims. And so that's the first element in a narrative. A second element in a narrative is a understanding, at least since World War II, that really wasn't as fully shared before then, but the Holocaust made it inescapable, of the enormous persecution to which Jews were subject over an enormously long time, mainly in Christian Europe. And that obviously culminates in the Holocaust. And that is also part of the narrative. You start with the Bible, and then you take this enormously powerful, horrific event of the Holocaust, and you say, the Jewish people were terribly oppressed. There's this religious claim. And, after being persecuted by Christian Europe, the least you people can do is let us have, a small, tiny nation state in a little corner of the Middle East. So you start with those elements of a narrative, and you build modern nationalism on that. You're good to go. Especially in the United States, which callously refused to allow Jewish refugees to come here when they could have been saved before the Holocaust, or a Europe which did the same thing. They have good reasons to be extremely guilty. And so they say, yeah, that's great. You guys go over there and do whatever you do to the Palestinians. So those are two elements of the narrative. A third element of the narrative is a classic settler colonial trope, which is you people are incompetent and incapable of bringing this place to fruition. And that's what the settlers in this country said. They said, look what the Native Americans are doing. These resources are going to waste. We can turn this land into X, Y, and Z. And they did. They did. Native Americans had an extremely efficient way to manage the resources of the North American continent, as they had of the South American continent. But, gold and manufacturing and factory farming and all of the glories, advertising and God knows what, have been produced out of this land and Canada and Mexico and Latin America as a result of settler colonialism. But the argument was, we can use it better than you can use it. Well, that argument is, we made the desert bloom. It wasn't a desert. There was 1.5 million people living there in 1948, of whom almost 2 million, actually, of whom 1.3 million were Palestinian Arabs and 600,000 were Jews. Well, they were not living in a desert, clearly. But that trope, making the desert bloom, it's a winner, especially when you're feeding it to populations that have grown up on settler colonialism, grown up on the frontier myth, and so on and so forth. And finally, only democracy in the Middle East. You manage to oppress a population as large as yours for 55 years, and you could still get away with that? They do. I mean, there's not one politician who won't repeat that rubbish, or almost no politician who won't repeat that in Washington. Well, that's an amazing job of public relations. So that's their narrative. Now, you're talking about the Palestinians. It's not entirely true that they never were able to put forward their discursively some kind of presentation, especially at the height of the strength of the PLO. They did an enormously good job, actually, especially with non-European countries, with many countries, most countries in the world, in fact, by projecting the Palestinian struggle as part of decolonization, by projecting it as a revolutionary change, not just in Palestine, but in the Arab world, they got enormous support in the 60s and the 70s and even into the 1980s. I think there have been failures since then, a lot of failures on the part of the Palestinian national movement. But Palestinian civil society has somewhat picked up the slack. And through BDS and through a number of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and a few other things, I think they've managed to get inside the public consciousness to a certain extent in Western countries and in many other parts of the world. But I would say that Palestinians are still way behind on the discursive level.
Maybe 2 more questions?
Sure.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. First of all, thank you for your time. I never got to take your class on my time at Columbia. It was early. It was 8:30. I'm not going to do that.
Yeah, well, the only time I could get a classroom big enough.
But I guess...
It was 8:40, actually.
Okay. 10 minutes, 10 minutes. I wanted to maybe politely give like an introduction as well as a question. I was an American Studies major at Columbia, and I think that it's perhaps a bit of a dangerous assumption or characterization to say that, you know, all populations other than Native Americans are settlers or immigrants, considering, you know, like Afro-diasporic populations in the Americas being like forcibly, you know, moved and violently moved into the, you know, Americas. And I think that I'm currently very curious as to, because, you know, on your last question, I think you point to something salient about indigeneity, which is, what is your relationship to this land?
Mm-hmm.
You know, is your relationship extractive? Is your relationship generational? Is your relationship tied to something other than what we can consider a settler colonial project? And I think that looking at Afro-diasporas in America and across the world, we are looking at a way of identifying or talking about indigeneity that isn't how we were talking about it 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And, you know, being at Columbia, you know, I saw a lot of Zionists take a lot of, I feel like, dangerous narratives around indigeneity, around relationship to land. So when we talk about this, like, nuanced conversation, you know, in Ireland or in other places, who is indigenous and who isn't, I guess I'm very curious to hear more on how you think the Palestinian example or, like, the Palestinian context gives us like language around indigeneity in this current day and age.
Yeah, that's a lot. There's a lot of food for thought in that question. You know, I think it's only recently that Palestinians and Palestinian activists and Palestinian scholars have come to the idea of indigeneity. You had people back in the 50s and 60s who argued in those terms, but there were few and far between. And even before, actually, you had some. And I don't think there was much echo to their thinking. I think that now, with intersectionality, a term I don't actually like, but it's a real thing, with an understanding that support for Palestine is coming from specific quarters of the world which see themselves as suffering things similar to the Palestinians, or see themselves in situations, if not parallel to, analogous to those of the Palestinians, that Palestinian thinking has to be broadened and come out of a silo. We're not the only people in a silo. There were always African American thinkers. There were always Native American thinkers. There were always Palestinian thinkers. There were always Irish thinkers who thought globally. But most of them in those groups thought in a silo. They thought of their problem, their struggle with their oppressor. And it takes a lot of mental agility to recognize, to get out of your silo and see how similar some of these situations are in some respects, and how connecting to those other struggles and to those other situations strengthens you and strengthens them simultaneously. And I think it's developed most amongst activists, and it exists as well to some extent among some academics. I don't think that it has gone down into much of the population, though the indigeneity argument resounds with Palestinians, I think, in a certain way. And it hasn't touched the political level, frankly. But then look at our country. I mean, I just don't see how the enormous activism and the enormous awakening among a whole generation in this country hasn't reached the media or the political level to a very large extent. So that's, you know, par for the course. I'm not surprised at that. I think that there's a lot to probably learn from thinking carefully about each of these different cases, because they're all really different. What African Americans suffered and went through in this country is completely different to what everybody went through. And what Native Americans went through and suffered in this country is completely different to what now, in some cases, their struggles and their situations connected. You have whole Afro-Indian populations in parts of the United States. But, you know, and those are two things happening in the same country. To compare that to Palestine or to compare that to New Zealand, you have to think very carefully, because they're not the same. And yet there are really powerful things can be generated from linking them.
Maybe one more question?
There was the woman who wanted to ask another question. She went away.
Go
ahead.
Mine are real quick. Just a follow-up to what I was asking, to how you responded to my last question, asking like what's in it for the U.S. and Europe. Would you then say that like Israel has like a military or like defense export or something like that? And then a separate question that's related is I was really struck when I was reading the book of how the narrative in the U.S. was kind of influenced by the Arms Export Control Act, and I was wondering if that has any teeth. Like, I think it gives the president of the United States the ability to control like arms exports and stuff like that, based on whether it's going to lead to like escalation or arms race and things.
The term is whether the arms are used defensively.
And then so I'm wondering if the narrative shifts, would that be useful, or is that just something that will always be kind of overlooked or not enforced?
I mean, it requires political will to enforce it, because in my reading, every delivery of arms to Israel is a violation of that act, because they're by and large not being used for defensive purposes. When you bomb 7 countries, you're not acting defensively. Now, there's a way of interpreting it in terms of preemption, but it gets pretty thin if you have any kind of objectivity in looking at it. So it requires political will to say these people bombed 7 countries with these weapons, these people are oppressing the Palestinians with these weapons. It's not defensive. I mean, how is occupying another country defensive? If they go berserk over the Ukraine, well, 55 years this has been going on in Palestine, and really longer. I mean, if you look at it over 100 years. So, quick answer, it could be used, but it requires political will, which is clearly not there. And yes, they're a huge arms exporter, and it's not just arms, it's expertise. It's expertise that they're exporting. And it's not just arms, it's this vast panoply of surveillance and spying and high-tech stuff that they sell all over the world. They have an enormous niche there. You might mention that I'm happy to sign books, if anybody.
Absolutely. So I think we're reaching the end of our time. I wanted to just bring us back to the very beginning of the book to end, because I think there's been some themes of the question of resistance, of optimism, of what's the role of the people in this history, this enormous imperialist forces that have maybe changed their primary source over time, but have not changed their military, political, and economic weight over this small country. The beginning of your book starts off with this statement of how Palestine is flourishing and how Palestine is changing, and actually all the many different industries that are growing, the opportunities that this is opening up for the Palestinian people before the Balfour Declaration. That's a really important thing to start with. This shows, and on top of it, in the in this early history that you're telling, there are individuals who are building the Zionist project. These are individual people who've built the Zionist project. It's not an inevitable thing. Those are two things that really I took from this book, from the moment I started reading it, as almost a sense of this can end. It started because of human will, and it can be ended by human will as well. So as much as there is so much against the Palestinian people, there is also so much possibility. And we have had so many examples of resistance in the face of the worst situation. The pandemic on top of the escalation of Israeli repression and violent aggression over the past 2 years has been almost impossible to comprehend. It has not stopped escalating, but the resistance also has not stopped. So I just kind of wanted to, these are some reflections I've been having from hearing the conversation, from reading your book, and also just from looking at the moment that we're in right now. And I just think it's so important to look carefully at the origins of this, because it actually can give us hope. It's not something that is part of the natural course of history. People decided to build this, and people can decide to take it down.
I agree.
Thank you so much for being here. We have copies of the book available at the front, and Rashid has offered to sign copies as well. So please don't miss this opportunity. Thank you all for coming, and we can continue to meet and talk here in this space, and I hope you enjoyed the session.